So, welcome. My name is Lani Morris, and I'm co-founder of the Map of Meaning International and co-author with our presenter of two books on the Map of Meaning. And it's our absolute delight to welcome you tonight in New Zealand, but wherever it is, whatever time of the day it is for you, to this third and final seminar in a series of three on meaning in unsettled times. So could you please turn off your cameras and make sure that you're muted? Because before I introduce our presenter, just a couple of practical things. We're just going to have a plain and simple webinar this session without an exercise for some of you who've been in the earlier sessions. But there will be, we hope, more time for questions at the end. So what we want is if you have a question during the time that we are in the webinar, please, you can type it into the chat, but head it question so that we can pick it up easily. Otherwise, don't use the chat unless you have a tech issue. And then if you could direct that to Katrina, Map of Meaning, she will be able to help you with that. So if you have a question, just type it into the chat titled question. But there will be time at the end to put questions into the chat. And we will also make sure that we capture all the questions and so that we have a chance to think about those and maybe include them in further workshops or somewhere else. So it's a delight and a pleasure for me to be able to welcome my colleague of the last 25 years, Professor Marjolein Lips-Wiersma, Professor at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, whose original work has given us the Map of Meaning. So Mario, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lani. Also for me, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. We organized this set of three webinars along the three stories of our times: the unravelling, business as usual, and the great turning. And just to remind you of each of the stories, the great unravelling is where ecosystems and social systems are falling apart or are deliberately torn apart. Business as usual is defined by Joanna Macy as global corporate capitalism dictating that which we can and cannot change. The third story of our time is the great turning. Each of these is a profoundly different lens through which we understand our reality, but they are also happening simultaneously. The great turning, in Joanna Macy's words, is the story we hear from those who see the great unraveling and don't want it to have the last word. It involves the emergence of new and creative human responses that enable the transition from the industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. The central plot is joining together to act for the sake of life on Earth. And in the previous webinars, we talked about how meaning steadies the ship at an individual level and at an organization level. Meaning is central to us joining together, not just out of duty, but by inviting each other into creative human responses. The great turning is about the lighthouse to the right of this image. It is about the hope and relief that we feel when we see the first glimmers of the shore, even though the journey of getting to the shore is still treacherous. And I particularly want to talk about these glimmers of hope today. But before we do so, I'd like to clarify a couple of things. First of all, we don't primarily face a technological crisis, but rather a human crisis. Transformation is not just about understanding the science or about using the latest technologies. It involves the human work of collectively making changes to our social, economic, and political systems. Too many individuals at present feel disconnected from these systems. Politics, business as usual, popularism dehumanize the other. Paid work can dehumanize ourselves as it treats us as numbers and objects. The internet can dehumanize. All of this can tempt us to behave instrumentally and choose to follow that or those that promise the most gain for ourselves with the least effort. At the same time, we see that in many domains, and I've just given some examples here, the workplace, whether it is law, whether it is education, whether it is around, the last one is around social media. And we see that there's a lot of rehumanizing practices are currently being introduced. Us concentrating on meaning over these 3 webinars is part of a bigger movement, focusing on who we can truly be as human beings when we respond to crisis and imagine different futures. The third point I want to make about that future is that we currently hear many very different stories about the future. And if you are like me, you may go round and round from one to the other and then back again. Perhaps you identify your own story of your future when you listen to this. One is that technology will save us, and there are many hopeful signs. Solar energy is now cheaper than all other forms of energy. AI is already making inroads into intractable issues such as food waste. We can grow veggies vertically, which also has the added benefit of growing closer to the end consumer and not shipping our food all over the world. And then when I dwell in that story for a bit, I think, yes, but there are so many unintended consequences of any technology, and any gains will not be equally distributed. So then my grumpy self pulls into another story and goes, well, humanity will need to learn a lesson before it acts. Things will need to get much worse before they get better, so that the wealthy or those in power also feel the effects. But the recent fires in LA showed that the very rich will always have alternatives. So the alternatives will need to come from the working class. And then I move to the next story and I go, oh yes, and the working classes and the middle classes have created change before. For example, in the Industrial Revolution, those who had capital seemed to win out at first and laborers lost. But through collective organizing, we could set things straight, or at least till about the 1970s. And then I go, so yes, there seems to be a lot less decency and more greed in the world. So my next story is, it may be too late. We may need to form islands of sanity, as Margaret Wheatley says, and be ready to rebuild from the edges when the world is destroyed. And then I go, yeah, but actually, that's not my story. I trust in humanity. And we are already doing many things. Look at our technology. Look at our young people. Look at all the people at the street at the moment. And so I go round and round. In the middle of all of these stories, it is very easy to get lost. And when humanity gets lost, we do some weird stuff. So let's look at reconnecting to that which is meaningful to us and how the map makes that visible and creates some calm and direction in all of this. By now, you know this map and how it helps to keep ourselves connected, how the map itself, but of course also very much the processes that we and you use with it, keep ourselves connected to personal meaning and to meaning in the context of organizing and organizations. We now zoom out to society level. Each of these outside bubbles of, for instance, transparency, co-creating, capacity building, and regenerating are not exactly a condition to each dimension of meaning. They are all connected. For example, transparent and truthful information is also crucial to unity and also to regenerating ecosystems and human systems. But similar to our earlier work with the map at the center here, it is helpful to break things down. It helps to make visible where the work needs to be done and is being done, and how that work supports our deep human need for a meaningful life. So I'd like to start with the inner and outer circles of that map. As we already saw when we looked at the stories about the future that we tell ourselves, we often ricochet between inspiration and reality. It is in that context that the three stories are very useful to make sense of the time in which we live. In recognizing that these stories happen simultaneously, we can look at possible futures while not being Pollyannish about the reality which we are currently facing. This best fits with all of our studies about meaning. These studies showed that day-to-day meaning is always experienced between inspiration and reality. And if either inspiration or reality is not attended to, meaning, such as unity or integrity or service, is often lost and we become quite unsettled. Reality without inspiration is anxiety-provoking or a grinding slug, a place we prefer not to go, and therefore we may collectively ignore what is going on with humanity and the planet right now. Because reality at this time may seem particularly grim. Because of this, it is good to not just face the facts, but also the feelings that go with that grimness, alongside the feelings that come with allowing ourselves to dream of the future. And in that context, I particularly like this quote by Parker Palmer. I'll just give you a minute to read it for yourself. Paradoxically, grieving for what is helps us to also stay better present to what we hope for. In this context of hope, what we are learning, or perhaps relearning, is that hope is not an individual quality of being an optimist or a pessimist, nor is hope passive in the sense of she'll be right. But it is an active and collective response, similar to the I have a dream response in the 1960s. And when we look at the green shoots, there is an enormous amount of citizen movement. In fact, before COVID, we had the largest amounts of people ever on the streets around the world protesting. The most exciting green shoot I see in that movement is the diversity. Here in New Zealand, when we recently had the largest Indigenous protest ever, we had young and old walking side by side and saw big signs with Asians supporting Māori. It is precisely in facing reality and seeing the chaos of unravelling and the complacency of business as usual that many people around the world allow themselves to be fully present in these times. It also allows us to imagine a different future. So to imagine that future, we will now go to each of the systems surrounding the map, starting with transparency. And I am going to start with this one because I think it might be the most difficult one, because it will need the most unified global action. We currently live in a post-truth society, which is defined, and I do find this definition quite interesting, as a period in history marked by public anxiety about what claims can be publicly accepted facts. We've already talked about anxiety and unsettledness. And transparency in the context of business or governance refers to being open about the facts, which leads to being honest and trustworthy. A lack of transparency and living in a post-truth society has an effect on living meaningfully because it shakes the foundations on which we base our behavior and beliefs. But we do see a turning. We do see green shoots of transparency. And for example, there is an increasing agreement globally and nationally about corporate reporting and on such issues as carbon, executive wages, etc. And increasingly the reporting of it, so making it open. For instance, there's a big call at the moment, or has been after the global financial crisis, that we should all be knowing what CEOs of banks, for instance, are earning. And many banks are actually reporting this, and others don't. But then we also know something about those banks. And we see increasingly reporting on the extended supply chain issues, such as slavery, and they're all being made very visible. Global reporting standards are being agreed upon, and authorities around the world are introducing legislation and penalties to combat the threat of greenwashing incidents. And it's quite fun. If you have a moment, you can see overviews of the biggest greenwashing fines that have had to be paid out to date. And you can find that online. Next to corporations, as per the Paris Agreement, countries too are now required to submit progress reports on climate mitigation, giving us a much better overview of which countries need to make changes where. And we have the UN Tax Convention going on as we speak, or maybe it has just finished. And so far that was supported by the G20, minus of course now the United States. It could result in a series of transparent tax policies that would have been unfathomable only 2 decades ago. We see transparency into sustainable finance, withdrawal from unsustainable investment. And the Montreal Accord commits countries to protect 30% of terrestrial and inland waters and marine coastal areas by 2030. And as a result of such accords, we are developing tracking tools to make transparent how protection of conserved areas are implemented over time. We see green legal suits in, for instance, NGOs suing governments in the Netherlands, Switzerland, etc., so that the governments have to become much more transparent about policies leading to truly closing the gap between what is done and needs to be done to stay at 1.5 degrees. And we still see much wonderful transparent reporting in mainstream media, playing an important role in activating people, such as recently in South Korea. So many untruths are thrown at us at present, but we are also experiencing much new openness. If we look at another element that is taking place at a social and systems level, rather than just an individual and organization level, we need to learn new capacities. Developing a human capacity is developing knowledge, skills, technical expertise, etc. This is in itself neutral, but in the context of business as usual, dictating what we can and cannot change, this story has primarily been about capacity that leads to productivity. But at present, there are some really interesting green shoots where we are also building new capacities. Of course, as you know, we are building a huge amount of technological capacity. And we see many green shoots. For example, in Sweden, they have just produced the first batch of zero carbon steel. And this is a biggie because steel and coal, one of the reasons, if we want to stay around the 1.5, we can no longer use coal. And one of the reasons some countries, some very large countries, have argued that they are going to still have to use coal is because it's the only way to make steel. So this is not done at a big scale yet, but it is very promising. But we need to complement these technical advances with the tools to change human consciousness and behavior. And we are already doing so. It is recognized on the global stage that we need additional human capacities. For example, we now have the United Nations Inner Development Goals. But also places of learning, including universities, are increasingly focusing on skills of collaborating, design, and especially complexity thinking, system thinking, imagining the skill of imagining different futures and better futures, and even mindfulness and hospicing. And hospicing refers to what we were just talking about, which is to tend to the grief of endings with wisdom. And in the West, we are relearning the capacity to think much longer term than the 3-year planning cycles. And in that context, we are also relearning to look at other models than Western models of civilization. Here in New Zealand, we see much more interest in indigenous models or ecological models such as permaculture. Co-creating is about having the relationships to create the world we want to inhabit. In a context of business as usual, it is often about teamwork, or as Joanna Macy says in her book on meaningful work, bogus consultation. But really, co-creating is about who gets to imagine, who gets to play, who gets to take risk, who gets to fail, who gets to ask the big questions. It is central to living meaningfully, as there will be no unity without justice, and no justice without all of those affected by decisions or their representatives being at the table. And we have some interesting debates worldwide going on about that at the moment. But we also see many green shoots. We have seen huge momentum around reinventing organizations so that we have far fewer hierarchies and managers and bureaucracies. And we have seen some forerunners, such as Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which has about 10,000 employees, but doesn't really have any form of management structure, attracting much more attention. And we now know that some of those organizations have been existing 10 or 20 years. Whereas even 5 years ago, we would kind of go, oh yeah, that's right, nice, but it won't last. But they are lasting. And Buurtzorg is just one example of that. We see that sustainability initiatives also lead to much flatter organizations because it is the only way to embed sustainability throughout the organization. And we see more and more community-led development. We see significant numbers of people embracing community training in new tools, such as deliberate democracy. And we see many of examples of solutions being designed with complex co-creating collaborations in mind. A fun example is the Gaipa cook stove project in Ghana, where the government, NGOs, private investors, and local community all work together to create safe and environmentally friendly cook stoves. To date, more than 5 million have been made, and only in co-creating with community does it even become logical that a stove is the most impactful place to start the great turning in this particular community. And finally, there is regeneration, which refers to rebirth or breathing the life back in. And in a context of business as usual, that is often presented as a win-win. But this rhetoric is also very effectively maintaining business as usual. Whereas regeneration is about a much more significant transformation than that. A transformation of all systems for everyone, so that they positively impact everyone. And we have already just looked at some examples of several systems regenerating. We've looked at some examples of green shoots, including educational, political, and corporate systems. So I just wanted to look at ecosystems here, where we see many green shoots as we learn more. For instance, introducing wolves in 1995 reintroduced beavers into Yellowstone Park 10 years later. Leaving nature alone in Costa Rica is completely restoring nature. We see that practices of permaculture and working of how to actually work with water restore nature in Africa. We see that seed bombs restore nature in difficult to reach places in India. And you simply just need to look online to see the green shoots of small-scale examples of regenerative agriculture all over the world. Personally, if I need an example, I'm always inspired by the story of Nobel Prize winner Wangari Maathai, who organized community to not only plant millions of trees in Kenya. This was an initiative that not only challenged patriarchy, but also reshaped local democracy, and that has been lasting long beyond her death in 2011. All green shoots are emerging, and all emerging initiatives challenge all systems, but we are already also seeing a lot of regenerating. So there is no doubt that the ship of humanity is in the midst of turbulent times, and that it will take us some time to get to calmer waters, and that the journey to get there may be somewhat treacherous or very treacherous, depending also where we live. Yet we also see many glimmers of the light. And we have found that the map helps to provide clarity and calmness as it helps us to act with consciousness and choice. Where do I want to put my energy? Importantly, it also ensures we are calm, ready, and collectively energized to contribute to the great big systems work. In the first webinar, we did attend to meaning that was under our control, alone and with others, through small-scale actions that do often actually end up having a much larger collective impact. In the second webinar, we looked at reclaiming meaningful discourses and narratives and treat each other as human beings, listen for meaning and talk about meaning so that global capitalism actually does no longer dictate what we can even talk about, let alone change. And in this third webinar, we looked at opening up to the largeness of life. And one way of doing that is by putting a particular percentage of our time aside for systems work. And in my own work, I find that I'm constantly going around doing all three of those. And I'm also finding that particularly the systems work is changing. When I became an academic 30 or so years ago, my systems work was at every meeting in a business school say, but shouldn't we have some course that actually challenges the economic models that we work with? And it took a couple of years of saying that, and people then got bored with me, and then I was able to at least have one course, obviously also using other elements in meaning and very much doing it with unity and support of colleagues. And then a while later, it was kind of, well, it's very nice to do this in the management context, but how about the accountancy context, and how about economics context, and how about the marketing context, all of these different degrees? Shouldn't we have courses like this as well? And then they were made core courses in all the degrees so that everybody actually could look at business from beyond business as usual. And then we basically started looking at how do we integrate all these new ways of learning in our new courses. None of that goes, of course, without any problems. I remember the first time we did mindfulness in an MBA course, and there was certainly a little bit of resistance, but not for very long. Because all of these things, and that is the wonderful thing about emergence, they are new and then they're just not. So I am looking forward to maybe also hearing some of your own examples of how you pay attention to meaning in your private life, meaning in organizations and organizing and opening up to the larger systems work. And my current challenge, I think, is that universities at all are probably no longer fit for creating a new future, or not entirely fit, or maybe not totally fit. Time will tell. So, again, doing another 5% of my time spending it connecting with others who think universities might need redesigning. So the work is never done. And I think I just want to encourage you to think about this, particularly if you are in jobs where business as usual is taking up a lot of your time, or where can you spend some time also on the great tuning and the systems work that is required. So I would like to hear your questions, but before we would do so, I would like to end with the following quote, which you can read for yourself. So perhaps take a minute or so to be with the rich soil and the green shoots of the great tuning and the questions and comments that emerge from you. We will give you a minute of quiet time to enter your questions into the chat, and then we'll hand it over to Lani.
Thank you, everybody. I think it's time for us to start to draw this to a close, because if we get into another question, it'll all get too exciting. I want to thank everyone for tuning up and for coming to the earlier sessions. I'd love to thank you, Mario, for all the work you've done, which has led to such a depth of understanding and such a powerful framework, which works, as you say, for the individual, so that we can monitor meaning in ourselves, but also within organizations. But now in this much, much larger framing of how do we as humanity use a framework of finding meaningfulness, which is, after all, absolutely core to us, to make sense of the bigger systems in which we find ourselves and find meaning and challenge them so that we can create futures worth having. So thank you all very much for coming. Please, if you have anyone you want to send this to, networks, friends, colleagues, people you want to show these seminars to, webinars to, they're up on our website. You can find the link. Please pass them on. If you can't find the link, just contact us, and I'm sure Katrina or somebody will pass them on for you, because we want them to go as far as we can. And if you're interested in what the map can offer you, your colleagues, your team, your organization, the world, then please look at our website to find out how you can continue to learn more about it and how maybe you could become a certified practitioner and use it. So thank you.
Join possibly a community of practice where we discuss
Absolutely.
These questions, because we have not attended to a whole lot. And also there might be a lot more collective dialogue on this rather than just asking me questions.
Indeed, that would be a wonderful thing. So we are looking at offering a community, thank you very much, Mario, a community of practice, particularly in this area, because this is where we need to come together and work together. Thank you all. Go well.
Thank you to Joanna Macy for the wonderful work that she has done. Yes. Lovely to see you all tonight.
Thank you. Bless you all.